For £8.50, it could be significantly worse. Timestamps in the video description to skip to whatever part you want. You shouldn't really need them, it's 10 or so minutes. Skip to the conclusion at the end to get my honest opinion on whether it's worth even £8.50 or $12 or so dollars. And apart from that, I hope you enjoy. If I hadn't mentioned it before, we're taking a look at the £8.50 90-watt cooler now, but in the future we'll be taking a look at the £16 160-watt cooler from PC Cooler. We'll see if it holds up to what it says, so stay tuned for that. So the question is, how do you assess an £8.50 cooler? Well, I think the same as any other. So, the packaging has a few actually reasonable claims, nothing too outlandish depending on your interpretation. Budget aside, it's funny how the 117mm tall cooler has a smaller box than the 40mm cooler being the G200P. But that's one of the elements that cuts the S83 down to £8.50. But that's enough about the box, let's take a look at the cooler. The first thing that struck me was the colour. Looking at the packaging, you'd think the paint job would match the two copper heat pipes. But no, we've got an almost red brownish colour which clashes with those heat pipes. Speaking of colours, yes, we have an 80mm yellow 3-pin fan. I'm not sure if I've spent too much time with this cooler, but it's sort of grown on me. It spins up to, or at least should spin up to, around 2,200 RPM plus or minus 10%, and it's genuinely very quiet at full speed. But having said that, I didn't really feel it shifting much air, which probably explains half of the quietness. If you want to know more about the cooler, here's a big S. That could stand for silent or speed, both of which are plausible, but I guess we'll never know. Anyway, it's fixed to the cooler with these anti-vibration mounts, referring to the packaging earlier. They're tougher than I thought. For example, I was able to get away with tearing the fan off the cooler like an idiot. It seems like you're actually supposed to squeeze the mounts to remove the fan by itself, but none of this really matters since you don't need to remove the fan anyway. As mentioned earlier, the total height of the cooler is 117mm, smaller than your standard 120mm fan. Both faces of the tower have a wavy fin style, which I spent way too long eyeing up, and the base of the cooler is just as interesting. We've got a heatsink that's been formed as part of the base plate for extra performance, hopefully, and the mounting bracket has been fixed to the front and back with some simple screws. Cheap and potentially effective. As for the base plate itself, removing the protective sticker left it, well, sticky. Taking a much closer look, you can see the grooves from the machining process. Smoother base plates increase the contact surface area between the CPU IHS and the base plate, requiring less thermal paste to fill in the gaps. To give you an idea of its smoothness, we'll compare it to a more expensive dual heat pipe cooler's base plate, the Noctua NH-L9i. The L9i by no means has a mirror finish, but its grooves are much closer together and shallower, reducing the amount of thermal paste required, which improves thermal transmittance. Anyway, that's enough of an overview. How does this thing perform? Well, before we can think of installing it for testing, it needs a damn good clean. And yes, made in China has been etched into the base plate. I mean, it was never going to be great, but rubbing salt into the wound like that, it doesn't help. So, how do we install this? For Intel sockets, it starts with this mounting ring, a term that's surprisingly safe to Google, which requires some plastic inserts whose positions depend on your socket. If you're mounting to an AMD socket from AM2 onwards, you don't need this ring. There's a small packet in the box which contains a couple of mystery thermal paste sachets and some plastic posts. After making sure you've definitely installed the inserts properly, the ends of the inserts can be poked through the holes in the motherboard, and similarly to any Intel stock cooler's pushpin mount, the plastic posts can be pushed through the inserts to secure the bracket onto the board. This basically forms the AMD stock mount for an Intel board. Now some thermal paste needs to be applied, and then the cooler can be lowered onto the mount. The smaller tab on the opposing side needs to be hooked in first, and then the near side angled thumb press can be wrangled into place. This thing takes an uncomfortable amount of force to apply. Either I got lucky here since my board still works, or I've learned a new level of appreciation for how strong motherboards are. Side note, after the testing, I removed the cooler to see how the thermal paste spread out after the testing. Bit of heat to let things work its magic. Turns out that it was completely fine on the IHS and the base plate. Adding to my comments on the force required to install this thing, you can go about it in a slightly different way, which feels a little better. You can press on the arms around instead, or in addition to the thumb press itself, and just click it into position. It feels a lot easier and less dangerous, even though you're exerting the same amount of force, but you're in a bit more control because you've got more points of pressing on it. I also think that feeling of it feeling like too much pressure, it's going to damage the board, it's kind of justified because you are pressing it all in one motion and you're putting a lot of force on the board itself, as opposed to using screws, which can provide a lot of force, but you're actually only applying that locally to the mounting points, not necessarily the whole board, and flexing it entirely. So anyway, moving on to the testing bit. So there we have it. The S83 is installed in a super quick fashion. Now let's get onto those results to see how it performed. There are two different setups I use with a couple different benchmarks. The first setup is simply called acoustic, which is an acoustically limited test. This means the fan is set to a speed which matches the 36.5 dBA acoustic target. This normalizes all the CPU coolers to a single reference point so they're more comparable. The second test is called stock max. This lets the fan spin as fast as possible to see how much performance can be squeezed out of the cooler and how loud it can get. Starting with Prominency 5 and Firmark, the first benchmark I use, with the acoustic setup, the toughest of them all, the only piece of information we need to focus on with regards to the S83 thermal performance is this number here, 7.7. This is the percentage of the 10-minute test the S83 was able to complete. After just under a minute on average across all three runs, the system crashed, hitting 100 degrees Celsius. Now, it's not alone. The same happened for the G200P, L9i, Samuel 17, L9X65, but they all lasted longer, and switching to the cooler stats graph and focusing on the purple bars representing cooler height, all are less than half the height of the S83, apart from the L9X65, which is just over half the height. While we're here, we can tell that adding to the thermal fail, the S83 is not far off full speed at 1800 RPM or 75% of its total speed. So how far can it go? Well, spinning it up to full speed, we've managed to eke an extra 0.5% more time to the test, so it's still a fail, but here's the catch. According to Hardware Info at least, the 6700K maxed out at 89 watts, so clearly this cooler isn't capable of dealing with the 90 watts as claimed. But sure, you could claim they're talking about TDP, not actual wattage, so why don't we turn it down? The second and last benchmark we're using is the 10-minute looping run of the 3D Mark Firestrike combined test. This benchmark sends the CPU package down to 60 watts maximum, 53 watts average across the 10-minute runs. Starting with the acoustically limited setup, at this wattage, even the PC cooler S83 manages to pass the test. But we're only about 5 degrees from crashing here since we're looking at delta T figures. The true temperature was actually 95 degrees Celsius, which gives us a strong inkling that the marketing is either talking about TDP and is relying on the vagueness of that figure, or it's just hedging its bets. We'll get onto the value of the cooler in a second, but the £8.50 S83 is doing decently compared to the low-profile £35 G200P and L9i. However, it's not doing so well compared to the similarly sized D9L, which, to be fair, at £50 is over 6 times more expensive. Pushing the fan back up to full speed, we got below 70 degrees Celsius delta T, a reduction of 3 degrees Celsius compared to the acoustic test. But all the other coolers managed to open the gap, and from what I can tell, that's all down to the low airflow provided by the fan. It spins fast, but it just doesn't have a high enough angle of attack or something to push enough air through. This is both a curse and a blessing. Switching over to the cooler stats for this test, despite the S83 running at over 2000 RPM, it's only outputting 37 decibels, which comparatively means it's the quietest on the board, and the hottest as well. Those fans spinning just don't seem to be pushing much air. So, moving away from the thermal and acoustic performance, let's quickly cover price. I wasn't able to find the S83 on PC Part Picker, so I've slotted in the £8.50 price I purchased it from eBuyer.com. As for the pricing for Europe and America, you might be able to find it from retailers you're familiar with, as I have from the UK, but you can pick it up from Alibaba for around €12 or $13. Clearly the S83 is the cheapest on the board, which makes me intrigued to test its bigger brother. But taking a look at the last graph, price versus performance, the performance coming from the acoustically limited Firestrike test, it's clear to see where your money is best spent. Sort of. To go for the S83 is great value, but only if it functions properly first. From my testing, at 60 watts, my 6700K at 90 degrees Celsius actual temperature isn't advisable long term. You might get away with this thing on lower power ranges of modern 4 or maybe 6 core CPUs if you're not loading them heavily, but I think the perfect scenario for this kind of cooler is an HT PC or home theater PC that'll play some Blu-rays and maybe some simple couch co-op games. What else is there to say, really? The colour scheme isn't great, build quality is very mediocre, decent enough for £8.50. I mean, coolers twice this price or more have similar build quality, so I can't complain that much. It has a colour to it. It's cheap enough that you could respray it or repaint it to something else, but the performance isn't really there. So again, like I said, maybe a 4-core CPU that's not that high on wattage and something you don't intend to push that hard. An HTPC, nothing that's going to do intense gaming, but, you know, for a 4-core, very sort of lowish wattage CPU, you might get away with it. Blu-rays and a basic computer for your home theater, maybe. So, thanks for checking this one out. I hope that was a very reasonable and fair approach and review for something that is admittedly extremely cheap and probably not worth spending this much time on, but sometimes it's worth to delve into all the details of something even this cheap to really understand what it's worth. So cheers guys, hope you enjoyed it, hope you subscribe, and if you want to support the channel even further, there's always Patreon, and that's about it. More videos over there, I guess, Patreon and stuff over there. Thanks guys, catch you in the next one, bye bye.